Let's get going. We're about to have our next panel. I'm glad to be joined first by Rafael Mangual, who's a senior fellow and head of research for the Policing and Public Safety Initiative at the Manhattan Institute, and the author of Criminal Injustice, which I think we have copies of. After Ralph's presentation, he'll be joined on stage by Rajiv Sethi and Glenn Loury. Please help me in welcoming Ralph Mangual.
Thank you very much. I just want to say I cannot really articulate fully just how much I feel like I don't quite belong on this stage. The richness of the ideas being presented so far at this conference, it's just really humbling for me. So I'm very, very grateful to be here. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to get into a very dense topic, so I'm going to go right into it. As you all heard, in February, President Trump ordered the agencies under the executive branch's purview to halt their reliance on what's known as disparate impact analysis. And for the non-lawyers in the room, disparate impact theory basically ignores evidence of intent to find employers, government agencies, and other legal actors liable for discrimination if their actions or policies, even and especially those that are race or gender neutral, disproportionately impact members of a protected class in some way. Now, the left was predictably upset by the announcement. The New York Times, for example, lamented that the president was stripping away, quote, a legal tool key to civil rights enforcement as part of a, quote, crusade to stamp out policies that benefit anyone who is not white and male. Now, one of the areas in which we've seen disparate impact analyses applied many times over the past 2 decades has been in the area of law enforcement, where racial disparities in measures like stops and summonses and arrests have been severed from their context and held up as prima facie evidence of discrimination worthy of federal interventions into policing, interventions which have ended up causing all sorts of problems like crime spikes. Now, leaving no doubt about what the administration's position will be on this approach to civil rights enforcement, the president, in a subsequent executive order, directed the Attorney General to review all ongoing federal consent decrees, out-of-court agreements, and post-judgment orders which state or local law enforcement agencies are a party to. Now, I don't have enough time to get into all the reasons why the conflation of disparity and discrimination is misguided. For those of you who want to know more, I recommend Thomas Sowell's wonderful book, Discrimination and Disparities, which makes that case forcefully. But the outrage about the Trump administration's view of disparate impact begs an obvious question, which is why are so many clinging to this dubious framework so tightly? And the answer, I think, is in part that disparate impact analysis essentially relieves those alleging discrimination of proving discriminatory intent. And that relief is important in the main, not because it makes litigation easier, but because it gives those who use race as a cudgel against certain institutions permission to sidestep the hard truths that they'd rather not acknowledge. Here are some hard truths to consider. In New York City, where 52% of the population is Black or Hispanic, those groups have constituted 95+% of all shooting victims and 95+% of shooting suspects every single year since the department began tracking those numbers in 2008. Blacks and Hispanics have also consistently made up more than 90% of New York City murder suspects and arrestees. In Chicago, which is less than 60% Black and Hispanic, those groups constitute at least 94% of homicide victims in the years 2019, 20, 21, 22, and 23. And when the 2024 data is put out, you can safely bet on seeing a substantially similar number. As I recently said in the New York Times, it's simply impossible for law enforcement to be responsive to a demographically concentrated violence problem without generating demographically disparate enforcement statistics. Unfortunately, getting to a saner criminal justice policy, which is what I try to do in my work at the Manhattan Institute, is going to take more than getting progressive critics of policing and criminal punishment to acknowledge that there are disparities in behavior that might explain at least some of the disparities we see in enforcement. And the reason for that highlights a fundamental question in our society's ongoing debate about what criminal justice should look like. And for many of those on, let's say, the other side, racial disparities in criminal behavior revealed by the crime statistics are a function of broader and curable societal failures to distribute resources equitably. In the minds of a lot of self-styled progressives, especially the police and prison abolitionist types, racial disparities in criminal behavior are the byproducts of disparities in income and wealth. Poverty, inadequate social spending, underfunded public education, the argument goes, are all at the root of a lot of the crime that we see. And because these social problems are unevenly distributed racially, so too are their byproducts. Now, I think this view is wrong. For one thing, we've seen measures of wealth, income, unemployment, education, and social welfare spending rise and fall over the decades. What we haven't seen is violent crime measures rise and fall with them in a way that the progressive account would predict. Consider, for example, the following facts. In 1989, New York City's poverty rate, which was 18.8% that year, was slightly lower than it was in 2016, when it was 19.5%. Why do I pick out those 2 years? Because 1989 is the year before homicides in New York City hit their peak of 2,262, and 2016 is the year before homicides hit their valley of 292. During the Great Recession, when the nation's unemployment rate doubled, going from 4.6% in 2007 to 9.3% in 2010, the homicide rate declined 15%, from 5.7 to 4.8 per 100,000. Income inequality, as measured by the Gini coefficient, grew about 20% across the U.S. between 1980 and 2016, yet the country's violent crime rate declined 35% over that period, from 593.5 per 100,000 to 386.3. Specifically for the Black community, consider that, as was noted in Barry Latzer's great book, The Rise and Fall of Violent Crime in America, that Black male earnings hit 250% of their pre-World War II level by 1959. Consider that the share of Black households that were owner-occupied increased by 65% between 1940 and 1960, and that the share of Black male households below the poverty line decreased from just shy of 71% in 1950 to 21.5% by 1970. And yet, the age-adjusted Black male homicide rate skyrocketed between 1950 and 1970, going from 47 per 100,000 to 78.2. But you may be wondering, if crime isn't driven by things like poverty, lack of education, then why are criminals so often poor and undereducated? And this question, however, reflects, I think, a misapprehension of the relationship between these factors. Yes, many criminals are neither wealthy nor educated, but isn't it just as plausible that the kind of disposition that leads one to, say, hold up a liquor store at gunpoint, shoot a rival over a trivial dispute, or join a violent street gang is negatively correlated with economic or academic success? This is where the debate starts to get uncomfortable, because it's simply not enough to just push back on the socioeconomic root cause story. Stopping there invites the following question, which is often posed in an accusatory tone. And the question is that if, in fact, racial disparities in law enforcement measures are driven by disparities in criminal victimization and perpetration to which law enforcement institutions are responding, but you don't think those disparities in criminal behavior are primarily a function of socioeconomic factors such that they can be addressed through economic redistribution and more social welfare spending, then what should we attribute these disparities in behavior to? I think those of us who want to have a more productive conversation about criminal justice should have an answer to that question, one that puts to rest concerns that we, particularly conservatives, believe that there's something inherently criminal about these populations. And so I want to give my answer today, and I think it comes down to two things. One, as we've heard today, is family structure, and the other is culture. Why do I say this? Well, for one thing, I think crime is largely a byproduct of the antisocial disposition of criminals, which is to say that I think that there is a significant psychological component undergirding criminal behavior. And I think that the psychological insights of scholars that have studied this have shown that psychological factors have more explanatory power than the standard view centered on socioeconomic factors. And I think the psychology of criminals is related to their experience in childhood, which in turn are related to family structures in which they're raised. Now, what does this have to do with racial disparities? Well, as we all know all too well, while about a quarter of white births are to an unwed mother, about 70% of Black births are. So let's get to the relevant psychological insights. A particularly common feature found by those who study criminal thinking patterns is that criminals often display a pathological sense of entitlement. When I refer to entitlement here, I'm doing so in the clinical sense. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, better known as the DSM, defines entitlement as, quote, unreasonable expectations of especially favorable treatment or automatic compliance with his or her expectations, and it is a salient or diagnostic factor in many of the personality and behavioral disorders that are prevalent in criminal populations, disorders whose signs are often recognizable in early childhood in the form of things like ODD, oppositional defiance disorder, which is a precursor to adolescent conduct disorders, which in turn is a precursor to antisocial personality disorders. Now, here are a few statistics to give you a sense of how prevalent those conditions are among criminal offenders. For juvenile offenders, the prevalence rates for conduct disorders range from 33 to 70%, depending on the correctional population being studied. While less than 3% of the general population in the US can be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, studies of prison populations around the world put the low end of the range of ASPD at 40%. A Bureau of Justice Statistics report using data from 2007 to 2009 found that 58% of state prisoners and 63% of sentenced jail inmates met the diagnostic criteria for drug abuse or dependence. These measures all rival the prevalence rate of poverty among surveyed prisoners, 43% of whom earned at least $22,500 in the year prior to their incarceration in 2014 dollars, which, by the way, was nearly double the poverty line for single men that year. So what then drives the development of these psychological conditions? And I think a big part of it comes down to what scholars in the field call ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And those are defined by the CDC, which, by the way, has noted that ACEs can play an important role in a child's future likelihood of perpetrating criminal offenses, as, quote, potentially traumatic events that occur in childhood, as well as aspects of a childhood's environment that can undermine a child's sense of safety, stability, and bonding. Examples of ACEs given by the CDC include experiencing violence, abuse, or neglect, witnessing violence in the home, growing up in a household with substance use problems. In a broad literature review published in 2010, scholars from the University of Cambridge listed out the predictors of adolescent conduct disorder development. Their list includes poor parental supervision, punitive or erratic parental discipline, cold parental attitudes, physical abuse, parental conflict, disrupted families, antisocial parents, large family size, and low family income. Now consider that a host of empirical analyses comparing single-parent households to those with intact families consistently find that children being raised in the former are at a significantly higher risk of experiencing lower levels of parental supervision, higher levels of parental conflict, lower levels of family income, higher levels of poverty, and higher levels of abuse and neglect. Sound familiar? Not only is there a substantial overlap between the kinds of ACEs that predict the psychological conditions prevalent in criminal populations and the kinds of ACEs that kids being raised in single-parent, particularly single-mom households are at risk for, the prevalence of single-parent households is statistically predictive of high crime rates, as was demonstrated in a paper I co-authored with Brad Wilcox, Seth Cannon, and Joseph Price, the latter two of whom did the econometric analysis. In that paper, we found that in cities above the median share of households headed by a single parent, total crime rates were about 48% higher than those below the median. Violent crime was 118% higher than those below the median, and homicides were 255% higher. Within the city of Chicago, we looked at census tracts above and below the median for share of households headed by a single parent and found that the total crime rate in those above the median was 137% higher than those below. The violent crime rate, 226% higher. The homicide rate was 436% higher. Now, as bad as the sorts of childhood adversity that predicts the kinds of psychological dispositions we see in criminal population is, those experiences are exacerbated, I suspect, by a well-documented subculture that's present in so many Black communities that suffer from high rates of crime. A subculture that elevates violence as a legitimate means of dispute resolution, of respect acquisition, and of child discipline. The evidence of this culture is widespread, and I document some of it in my book, Criminal Injustice, where I give an overview of the research on this by scholars like Elijah Anderson, whose phenomenal book, Code of the Street, is absolutely worth reading if you haven't. I also highlight some examples of this kind of cultural attitude acknowledged throughout Black pop culture, particularly in stand-up comedy, which offers some rich examples, one of which is the well-known set of Cedric the Entertainer during the famous original Kings of Comedy, wherein he describes the difference between whites and blacks primarily coming down to the fact that while white attendees at the show might hope that no one took their seats during intermission, blacks, by contrast, would wish a mother would. Now, I know I'm starting to run up against my time, so I hope we can get deeper into this point about culture during the following discussion. But before I end, I do want to bring one point home. The debate about root causes of crime is more than just an academic disagreement. The different views on this question reflect something that the great Thomas Sowell put his finger on in his book, Conflict of Visions. Those of us who subscribe to a more constrained view of the world understand that problems like inequality, poverty, and predation have been present across every human society that's ever existed. Those who take the unconstrained view believe that these are problems that can be eliminated, but they're wrong. This is not to say that there's nothing that we can do as a society to improve these outcomes, and there are good reasons, independent of their purported connection to crime, to reduce poverty, inequality, unemployment, etc. But you simply do not need to solve the world's problems to control crime, particularly violent crime, which continues to wreak havoc in the Black communities throughout this country in a way that we could never imagine for white communities. We tested that hypothesis throughout the 1990s and 2000s when it was demonstrated that sharp declines in violence could be achieved without doing anything about the kind of structural problems that progressive critics of law enforcement often point to as drivers of crime. But if that fact wasn't able to put the socioeconomic root cause argument to rest, my hope is that a demonstration of the relationship between crime and a different set of root causes, unfortunately one we don't quite yet know how to definitively address through public policy, will finally get us back to a point when we can reprioritize the kind of enforcement strategies that make the communities suffering the most under the weight of persistent violent crime problems safer and the people living in them better off. I'm going to end with a visual depiction of what it means to fail on that front. What this graph shows is the firearm homicide rate for men by race. And in 1990, which is near this country's peak for homicides, what you see is a massive gap between blacks, whites, and Hispanics in firearm homicide victimization. And that rate is near its peak at above 50 per 100,000. What you see as policing, incarceration, criminal justice policy in general got tougher through the mid-1990s and early 2000s, it produced a sharp decline in that problem, one that was primarily benefiting Black Americans. If you look at the white rate, it's pretty much steady along the bottom of the x-axis. The most tragic thing that I've experienced in my life from a professional standpoint is to view the area in which I've dedicated my life's work, throw away so much of the progress that was gained in that time period. Because by 2021, the Black firearm homicide rate reached its 1990s peak. And that's what it means to fail on this front. So I'm going to stop there and now take on my biggest fear, which is that we have Professors Glenn Loury and Rajiv Sethi who are going to come on stage to share their reactions to my remarks and critique them, after which we'll have a brief conversation before opening things up to questions. So thank you all very much.
Way to go, Rob.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, you can do it up there.
Or first of all, I'm told I have 5 minutes to respond, and then we have a discussion. So, I want to just thank the organizers, Ian and others, for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. The warmth of the welcome, in particular, thank you, has been very touching, and the handwritten note by Rebecca is something I've never seen before. It's really wonderful. I have 5 minutes, I was told, to just give some initial remarks. And I just want to use that time to make 5 quick points. Let me just first say that I'm not a clinical psychologist, I'm not a sociologist of culture, and I'm not even an applied econometrician, so I'm not going to speak directly to the empirical evidence and the claims that Ralph has made. But I'll talk about work that I've been doing over the past 20 years or so with my Columbia economics colleague, Dan O'Flaherty, mostly contained in our 2019 book, Shadows of Doubt, and a number of articles since and earlier. And we approached these same issues, the root causes of crime and the policy implications, from our perspective as economists, which means that we have a relentless focus on incentives and information. And one of the things that we do when we see disparities across groups or differences across individuals is try to focus on the differences in incentives that they face and the differences in beliefs that they hold, including beliefs about each other. Now, I want to use my few minutes to make 5 points. 1, marginal penalties matter. 2, preemption and retaliation are powerful motives, especially in understanding homicide. 3, collective silence is sometimes rational. 4, stereotype traps exist. And 5, culture is endogenous. So very quickly, marginal penalties matter. So imagine 2 countries. One of them, you have somebody who commits a very brutal assault and is sentenced to 20 years for it. Another country, somebody kills 77 people in a single incident over the course of a day and is sentenced to 21 years, which is the maximum allowable sentence in that country. Which country has the more punitive system? Well, it seems obvious that it would be the first one. Now, this is not a hypothetical example. The 20-year sentence was for a very brutal aggravated assault by Darrell Watson on Jashawn Boyd. They were both waiting for sentencing in the Essex County Correctional Center a couple of years ago. And the other cases from Norway, that is Anders Breivik, who killed 77 people, the largest mass shooting incident in that country, more than anything we've experienced here, certainly more than Las Vegas and the Pulse nightclub. But let's think for a minute. Darrell Watson was already facing 50 years for a prior murder conviction. The incremental sentence, the 20 years, was practically negligible. There's no deterrence effect if you're facing such a long sentence of something else being stacked on top of it. So the penalty that he faced was essentially zero. He's not going to live long enough for that additional sentence to kick in. And so when we think about punitive systems, we need to take into account exactly how penalties stacked one on top of each other affect the deterrence effects of subsequent activity. And this is, I just linked to the fact that US prisons have such high homicide rates. People are under surveillance. They have limited access to weapons and alcohol. They have emergency medical care nearby, but they're 2.5 times likely to be killed in an age-adjusted way relative to people in the general population. And part of this has to do with the fact that you can't really impose significant penalties on people who are already facing very heavy penalties. Second, very quickly, preemption, retaliation, powerful motives. Homicide, murder in particular, is a very unusual crime. It's the only crime that you might commit simply to prevent it being committed to you. You're not going to burgle somebody's house because you're afraid of being burgled and so on. And this kind of dynamic can cause preemption and retaliation to be very, very important sources of interpersonal violence, especially of homicide. This effect becomes especially important when the law enforcement system is not protective of you. If you feel that you can be killed with impunity, those are the conditions under which taking the law into your own hands starts to become terribly important. The clearance rate for homicide, the black-white differences in clearance rates across cities are very substantial. We have only found 3 cities, Dan and I, where you have rough parity between black and white clearance rates. The likelihood that a murder is going to be solved conditional on the race of the victim. For the remaining 40, sometimes you get as much as a 2-to-1 disparity. It's much less likely that somebody will be apprehended and punished for killing you if you're black than if you're white. And what this means is that preemption and retaliation become very, very important motives with regard to interpersonal violence. This is our understanding of why you have so much violence involving gangs today, but also historically with the Appalachian feuds, the Hatfields and the McCoys, the organized crime violence during the Prohibition era in Chicago, and so on and so forth. There are plenty of historical examples. Very quickly, stereotype traps exist. If you look at the FBI Internet Crime Report, it details about, I think, $16.6 billion in total internet crime for 2024. I think 18,000 odd incidents. There's $20,000 for the average loss. Most of these crimes are committed out of fake call centers. And one of the hubs is in Kolkata in the state of West Bengal in India. There are other centers in Bangalore and other parts of Asia and so on and so forth. The largest internet heist, which was $230 million in one single Bitcoin theft online, was conducted by, in part, by a group of young men, including a teenager from Danbury, Connecticut, whose father is a vice president at Morgan Stanley. Now, this speaks to the point about poverty not being responsible for crime. I can't speak to the psychological, and this was an intact family. But these are people, the reason I mention them is because they fall under the category of what in the US are called model minorities. The stereotype of the model minority is not affected by this extraordinary crime, which is really on a very large scale and hurts a lot of people, their entire retirement incomes being lost and so on and so forth through internet crime. Why does it not? And this is, I think I'll stop after this because I'm out of time. I can't continue with the rest of my planned remarks, but let me just stop with this. When we have stereotypes of criminality, stereotypes of criminal behavior, what is it based on? It's based on three things: victim surveys, arrest rates, and incarceration rates. What determines those rates? Well, only those crimes in which the victim can be identified to some degree by the offender can be identified to some degree by the victim, and that results in arrest, prison admission, and long sentences. Let's just think very briefly about crimes of acquisition, and then I'll stop. The crimes of acquisitions that we have studied, in particular, there are 4 index crimes: robbery, larceny, burglary, and motor vehicle theft. There are years in which robbery is less frequent than all of these others, in particular burglary and motor vehicle theft. These are all serious crimes. But robbery is much more likely to lead to arrest for obvious reasons, right? Victim can make a very quick report and give a description of the suspect. It's much more likely to lead to prison admission conditional on arrest. It's much more likely to have a longer sentence conditional on prison admission for understandable reasons, because there's fear involved and it's considered to be a violent crime. But what that does is it entrenches a stereotype of violence because of the visual impact of arrest rates and of incarceration rates. And that stereotype, what I call a stereotype trap in my work with Dan, it creates incentives to actually, if you're going to commit a crime of acquisition, that is one arena in which it pays to be feared. You're not going to meet resistance. People will hand over their money very, very quickly. You're not going to go and bother with burglary and motor vehicle theft because it's much easier to commit robbery. There's a very poignant passage from Brent Staples' memoir where people were just handing him money, in Chicago actually, thinking that he's going to rob them when he was just taking a walk on Lakeshore Drive. But basically, the stereotype creates the incentives for entering into particular types of activity. And as an economist, I think of crime as an activity, as an economic activity in many cases. But in a way that entrenches the stereotype itself, which is what I meant by the stereotype trap. I think I better stop there and let Glenn have a word. Okay.
Thanks.
If it's okay, I'll speak from my seated position. Good to be here with you people. Congratulations and thanks to Ian Rowe for continuing this tradition of Old Parkland reflections on race inequality, economics, and public policy. I was challenged by Rolf. Brilliant young man. He's got his finger on something important, and he's telling the truth. And it's hard to hear. So much talk about racial disparities here at Old Parkland. And they are substantial and they are persistent, and we are well into the 21st century, and the civil rights movement is ancient history. As between two narratives that you could imagine to deal with and account for racial disparities, one I'm going to call the bias narrative, and it leads to the kind of thing that Rolf was criticizing at the start of his remarks, disparate impact analysis and so on. It's driven by shame and blame and the avoidance of responsibility, the bias narrative. They won't let us in. It's unfair. The system is rigged. We're not represented in the selective elite institutions because the system is rigged. We're overrepresented in the jails because the system is rigged. Our families are in tatters because the system is rigged. Poverty is higher because the system is rigged. Neighborhoods are segregated because the system is rigged. That was not a bad story in 1940. Grenard Myrdal, it was not a bad story in 1940. It was not as good a story by the time you get to 1960, as has been pointed out, and it was damn sure the wrong story by the time you got to 1980. But it persists to be the story well into the 21st century, the bias narrative. There's another narrative, the development narrative. The narrative that says, yes, history has dealt us Black people a bad hand, but the ball is in our court and we need to man up and woman up. We need to raise our children. We need to acquire skills. We need to compete. We're not always going to win. Let the chips fall where they may. Take responsibility for our lives. Stop with the reparations, give me a handout bullshit. The development narrative, I favor the latter. I favor it because it's the only way we're going to get a solution to the problem, but I also favor it because it lets me hold my head up high. It lets me walk into a room like this one without being ashamed of my people. The development narrative. Seize the nettle. Take it up. Come what may. Let the chips fall where they may. What was wrong with affirmative action? Well, it was unfair to Asians. Yeah, I remember that. What was also wrong with affirmative action is that it substituted preference for achievement for Black people. The SAT scores gave us the wrong numbers. We decided we wanted to do something about that. The thing we didn't do was develop Black people. So, disparities, how do we talk about it and what are we going to do about it? We heard Jim Heckman talk about not being able to talk as he would like to talk about racial disparities and family structure because a ton of bricks would fall on him. We heard Melissa Kearney say the same thing. How do we talk about it? What do we do about it? The first order of business is to tell the truth. To tell the truth, come what may. Why? Because it's efficacious to tell the truth. That gets you working on the real problem. Also, it's politically beneficial to tell the truth because you don't think people can see the truth? They can see it, and when you prevent them from saying what they can see, they harbor resentment, and that resentment builds up over time, and it can get unleashed, and it has been unleashed in the form of, well, President Donald Trump and company taking a meat axe to DEI and all of the rest of it, fulfilling the populist urgings of their political base who resent having post-George Floyd riots forced down their throats as mostly peaceful protests, fiery but mostly peaceful. Tell the truth. It's going to come out anyway. You might as well tell the truth. The other thing that needs to be done is to change the culture. The culture, by the way, is not just Black culture. There is Black culture, but the culture is not just Black culture. Culture is endogenous and it's conspicuous. Black people are affected by trends in American culture. You don't think feminism or gay rights or transgenderism, the roots of it, affect what's going on in Africa? You don't think the Democratic Party affects what's going on in Africa, et cetera? Tell the truth and change the culture. That's why I'm going to plant my flag. How about you?
Well, that was incredible. So my job is to lead us in an exchange for the next 15 or so minutes before opening it up to the audience for Q&A. But I don't know that if I can follow that with anything of value because it was so well put and it was so strongly delivered. But
Excuse me, Ralph, can I just say I didn't come here intending to say that. I really didn't. I came in here with a whole apologia plan, but the Spirit moved me and you were prompting. So
thank you.
Glenn, can I ask a question?
Sure, why not?
You're going exactly down the right line. You started talking about the Democratic Party. How much does democracy and the way that the race issue is used to win elections and to organize groups,
Well, there are people, I'm not a political scientist, probably better qualified than me to address that question, but let me just say, I promise you I'm going to appoint a black woman to the Supreme Court, I'm going to appoint a black vice president, and by the way, if you want to ask for a driver's license before you cast a ballot in Georgia, it's Jim Crow 2.0. Who said that? Joseph Biden said it.
To the Morehouse, remember the graduation speech to the kids in Morehouse College?
Yeah, that
They
was.
had no opportunity.
I wrote about that for City Journal. It was very disappointing. It was a bit.
But is this intrinsic to democracy is the question.
I see. Politicians need votes. They buy them by appealing to interest groups' weakest points and so on.
Gentrification and all these other matters. What it really is the victimhood narrative and the sense of I'm going to give you some goods, and you're being screwed by the system. That is very powerful rhetorically. At least I can see it in my own city, and I think it's generally true.
I think that's right. I think that's right. And actually, it prompts me to get into something that Glenn, you mentioned, which was that a lot of the speakers at this conference so far, including Jim, have mentioned that it's difficult to talk about these issues. And I tried to get at that a little bit in my talk, because what really motivated me to try and find an answer to that question of, well, if you don't think it's poverty or inequality, then, aren't you just saying that there's something inherently criminal about these populations? And, I think part of the challenge is that a lot of people on our side aren't very good at displaying empathy and convincing people that they care. And that's something that I've always tried to be really careful about. But I also think that you're exactly right to put your finger on a sense of fatigue, to use a word that's been in the news the last few days with these ideas. And I do think that we're starting to see the research community push back in some ways. You have Melissa Kearney's great book, but you also have, just to a point that you made, Rajiv, you mentioned the higher homicide rate in prisons compared to the general population. But it prompted me to think of a paper that was recently published by Sam Norris, Jeff Weaver, I forget who else was a co-author on that, but they used data out of Ohio to look at the effect of incarceration on life expectancy. And they found that life expectancy actually was boosted during periods of incarceration, that those increases in health and decreases in mortality held post-release. And part of what they saw was a halving of the likelihood of being murdered while incarcerated. Now, the reason that I mentioned them is because they are also the authors of another study that earned them quite a bit of hostility in response that was published in the American Economic Review. And it got at something that's been mentioned a couple of times already throughout this conference, and it's the idea of parental incarceration, right? We've heard it suggested that, part of the reason why we don't see as much marriage in the Black community is that Black men have been extracted from the community through incarceration, and so there are just fewer people to marry, which suggests that these are people that would have likely gotten married anyway, that they had that kind of desire, and that they would have been positive forces in their households. What Sam Norris and Jeff Weaver did in their paper that was published in AER was actually look at the impact of incarceration of a parent on childhood outcomes, and found that parents who were on the margins of incarceration, their kids, the ones whose parents went to jail, had better outcomes. More educational attainment. They were less likely to be arrested or incarcerated themselves in the future. And this was such an uncomfortable finding for the research community that people were actually demanding that the American Economic Review retract the paper. Not because the analysis was wrong, not because the data was bad or uncleaned, but because it made people uncomfortable. And what I'd like to ask you both, who have proven to be resilient throughout very long and successful academic careers, is how do you get past that, and how do you encourage researchers to get more comfortable with tackling the hard questions and telling the hard truths?
I mean, the AER published the paper you mentioned. I'm familiar with it, and I think that ultimately, in the long run, it will benefit the authors. I mean, you're right about the short-term pushback. I think Melissa was very careful about saying that one doesn't want to favor preservation of families under conditions in which it would be harmful for the children, and you've given an example in which it would. But if I could sort of answer in a sort of oblique way. A lot of what I've heard, especially about the success sequence and some of the policy implications that have emerged this morning, are about sort of exhortation. Ian also mentioned about some of the instruction that is given about the success sequence, about getting a job and so on before entering into parenthood. And the thing that worries me a little bit about that is I think we need to understand whether what people are doing is in their own interests, conditional on what other people are doing. Are these cultural practices an equilibrium phenomenon, or are they based on ignorance about what's good for oneself? If they're based on ignorance about what's good for oneself, then celebrities' statements and exhortation and telling people, hey, change what you're doing, pull yourself up with your bootstraps and so on and so forth might well work. You're giving them information that will be beneficial for them. But if culture is an equilibrium phenomenon, and Glenn has got really, I think, very important work on this with Han-Min Fang of the University of Pennsylvania, about culture as an equilibrium phenomenon, where collectively a group can benefit from changing their practices, but individually nobody has an interest in doing it. United Kingdom, to take a trivial example, may benefit from starting to drive on the right, just as continental Europe does. But they'd have to have some extraordinary level of collective action. It happened in Sweden, for example, a long time ago. But you can't have, just say people, hey, we'd all be better off if we just drove on the right, and expect individuals to then start doing that. And so the question then becomes, these kinds of policy, the success sequence type policies, and I can see their value if there was collective action behind implementing them. But I can also see why people might just ignore them or take them into account temporarily and then retreat from them.
Well, this brings up something that Glenn pointed out. In the culture debate, you have these two competing narratives: the bias narrative. You have the development narrative. And when I was thinking about the bias narrative, I do think there is an argument to be made that the intergenerational transmission of this story, that America is against you, that you won't be welcome, that you're not going to be allowed to achieve, that incentivizes a kind of, separatism is probably the right word, but a sort of rejection of mainstreamness within the affected communities, and sort of disincentivizes integration in a way that has proved to be a sort of durable barrier, much in the way that, Thomas Sowell writes about geographic factors, being a barrier to cultural diffusion, such that you end up seeing historical examples of, peoples in mountain valleys being much more backward and progressing much slower than people who are native to, coastal areas with natural ports, where they get to, engage in more trade and identify the cultural traits of the people that they interact with and adopt the positive ones. Do you think that there's something to that? Where do you think that the pressure comes from to create that kind of barrier to cultural change?
I'm struck by the success of Black Lives Matter as a movement in the aftermath of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, and especially George Floyd. If you were to pick up the manifesto and read the committed principles of the movement, they are, where if I were to say anti-American, it wouldn't be an exaggeration. If I were to say anti-Western, it wouldn't be completely wrong. Contempt for the family and so on like that. And okay, so you have a radical group, they have a view, but why would that become a mainstream view? Why would people be lining up in, my wife and I like to go up to northern New Hampshire. There's a town up there that we enjoy staying in an inn that, we were driving through shortly after the Black Lives Matter riots of 2020. And we saw a group of white kids with signs walking along the roadside in the middle of nowhere saying Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. So obviously they had caught a wave of moral panic kind of sensibility in the culture, the political culture. But yeah, I gave me 1619 Project. You could critique it from a similar perspective. And I think these narratives are important. I want to say something about research and what gets published in the American Economic Review, because I think, I want to say a couple of things. One thing is about research communities that are politicized, where the content of the studies end up affecting policy. Given the growth of the state and the various sinews of influence throughout society, the monies that are being allocated to policy production process, expertise, expert research feeding into that process, and a study that has the, quote, wrong finding, that is to say, a finding that weighs against what is the popular sentiment in a research community, is going to attract a lot of effort to, quote unquote, debunk it. This is endogenous. The effort to refute the bad study is going to be greater than the effort to refute the good study. And by that process, a bias in what the community ends up producing as credentialed research is going to be created. The other thing I want to say is, my friend, my dear friend Rajiv says hortatory lecturing of people, and he cites me. It's a waste of time because we're in an equilibrium and you could get any individual to change and that wouldn't change the incentives for the rest of them, so we're stuck. We're kind of stuck in an equilibrium. And I did write that paper with Han-Ming Fang, and we did find that it was it's a little bit like, I don't want to carry a gun if fewer than 50% of the people in my community are carrying a gun, but I do want to carry one if more than 60% of the people are carrying one. It's an equilibrium for 100% of the people to be carrying a gun, and you don't change it by telling people individually to not carry the gun. But there's been a lot of cultural change. The civil rights movement was cultural change for American politics. The Black Power movement was cultural change for African American identity. Since there's been a lot of hortatory do the right thing by women, do the right thing by gays. I mean, it's obvious that we produce a consensus about what we value and about how we informally enforce conformity to our values through a process of mutual influence. You don't think Hollywood matters? What's on the HBO and Netflix matters? You don't think the speeches that are acceptable at political conventions matter? You don't think me being a Black person telling Black people to pull up our socks and stand up straight with our shoulders back matters? It matters, I think. So I'm for exhortation, even though I recognize the incentives of the equilibrium.
Okay, so we've got 10 minutes left before we break. So I want to open it up to questions. I'm going to start with Delano, and then we'll go to Howard.
Thank you. A great presentation. I had a question about harm reduction that I was going to ask you, Rafael, in terms of violence and some other things, but I was moved by Glenn's presentation. So I'll ask this question. Glenn, you mentioned Black Lives Matter. I've written before on the need for a Black Wives Matter movement in terms of rebuilding the Black family that would do very much what you're talking about, right? Harness the moral, social, financial, and political capital, specifically of the Black community, to move the ball on this particular issue internally. So I'll ask this question because I don't think this has been addressed much over the past 2 days, which is, how would you speak to the role of religious institutions, and particularly the church, as it relates to moral formation? Because as someone with 4 children, I could teach my kids, you shouldn't steal because incarceration will drastically reduce your employment opportunities. Or I could teach them, you shouldn't steal because stealing is a sin, stealing is wrong, and the squire's children do not steal. And I think one of the challenges with having conferences where academics sort of lead the way, and this is not a criticism, it's an observation, is that it seems as if economists are reluctant to speak in moral terms unless it's a certain range of issues. Men should pay child support, but the shoulds in terms of going to college don't always translate when it relates to, let's say, getting married before having children. So can you speak a little bit to getting not just comfortable with results of studies that may offend, let's say, low-income Blacks, but getting comfortable speaking in moral terms even to one's peers? And that, one, and then two, as I said, the role of the church and religious institutions in shaping values and forming morals.
Yeah, briefly, I think the consensus on values that can be imposed through legislation and public action is thin. That is to say, it's not a fixed set of beliefs, it's a relatively loose set of beliefs. So, we could give examples, but the equality of people independent of their ethnicity or social identities or whatever would be one such. I think what the self-selected associations of churches and other like-minded aggregations allow, because you can leave, you don't have to be there, is for a thicker, the articulation of a thicker, more concrete and specific set of restraints, mandates, expectations, values, norms that people can embrace and can be reinforced in the embrace of, can find in the practice of their co-congregants a mirror through which to see their own ideals affirmed, and that's a good thing. Now, I'm not an expert on religious trends and whatnot. Secularization is a fact of our time, and so on. The Black church is not what it used to be in terms of its hold on African-American social and cultural life, but I think there still is a role for those institutions where they are robust to reach people and to move people. So, and I talk a little bit about this in my memoir, Late Admissions, Confessions of a Black Conservative, available at your bookseller now, where I talk about the role that religion played in my own life, my faith journey and whatnot, but also about an institution that I saw get built from the ground over a period of years that made a magnificent contribution to Black life in the urban area of Boston. So, yeah.
Howard? Hang on, just wait for the mic.
I have to ask Rajiv, do you disagree with Ralph? Because it seems to me you're saying that violence is a rational behavior when clearance rates for murders are low. Yeah. Do you disagree, or do you think your view complements his view?
That's, thank you for that question. I think that there are two positions that Ralph has advanced. One is on the root causes of crime, where he emphasizes culture and psychology, and the other has to do with our responses to it, right? The policy implications. And one doesn't have to accept the particular vision of root causes that he advances in order to accept the policy implications that flow from that. There are other approaches to root causes that can lead you to the same policy implications. So Harry Holzer made a very important point earlier about the studies about policing and the effects on crime victimization, and the evidence is overwhelming. And he mentioned Aaron Shelfin, but one of the co-authors of that, the latest study, is Morgan Williams, my colleague at Barnard. And so it is not, the policy implications with regard to what should be done to reduce crime victimization don't hinge on the particular explanation for the root causes that he is offering. I'm offering you a different causal explanation for crime, but it doesn't conflict with his conclusions with regard to what should be done. Now, very specifically and quickly about clearance rates, there are two stories, there are two narratives about why clearance rates are so low when victims are Black relative to when victims are Black. There's one story you might think of as an activist story, which is that people don't care about Black lives. The politicians, the police, the prosecutors, somebody dies, there's less urgency to try to solve that crime, and so therefore the clearance rates are low. There's another view which is more commonly expressed among law enforcement, which is that we can't get witness cooperation. You can't solve homicide without witness cooperation. And if you don't have the witness cooperation, you're going to have low clearance rates. Okay, next question. Why does one have low rates of witness cooperation? Of course, there are some obvious reasons, which is the fear of retaliation and so on and so forth. But again, we get back to a kind of equilibrium. This is what I was going to say when I said collective silence is sometimes rational. Basically, in order for you to come forward as a witness, there's a considerable amount of risk involved. But the effectiveness of your testimony is going to depend on corroboration. You need to have expectations that other people are also willing to come forward. And you have got situations where people have been killed with 15, 20 witnesses, and none of them will come forward because none of them expects anybody else to come forward. So again, this goes back to the point of equilibrium behavior. Finally, one last thing. One thing I find refreshing about this conference is that it has got a very wide range of opinions about these really important social issues. But typically, when you talk about crime, policing, and criminal justice, it is very polarized. People pick and choose studies that favor their narratives, and they neglect evidence that doesn't favor the kind of narrative that they're trying to push. And I think in this issue, we got to draw on both. I think there is some truth to the fact that homicides with Black victims are not treated with the same kind of urgency, the same kind of media scrutiny, the same kind of urgency on the part of politicians and prosecutors and so on, while at the same time recognizing that the absence of witness cooperation is a really, really serious problem. But again, it's an equilibrium situation as far as I see it. You can't tell people, hey, if you cooperate as witnesses, you'll be safer as a community. It's true, it would happen. But exhortation is not going to get us there. I'm not opposed to it at all. I'm just a little bit pessimistic about the effectiveness of it.
And if I could just add on the clearance rates, I mean, there is some research showing that the racial gaps in clearance rates do shrink when you take account of certain contextual factors with respect to the homicide in question. For example, shootings have lower clearance rates than fatal stabbings or fatal beatings, right, where there's a lot more physical evidence. People have to get close to each other. Homicides that occur outdoors are harder to solve, generally speaking, than homicides that occur indoors, drive-bys versus interpersonal physical conflicts. Also, detective workload in the department in question is a significant predictive factor of clearance rates, and we know that in higher crime communities, detectives are significantly more overwhelmed. The amount of resources available to dedicate to investigations, all of those things, when controlled for, do tend to shrink the racial disparity in clearance rates. So I just wanted to.
Can I say one brief thing about that? After the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, there were 2 reports by the Department of Justice, and depending on where people are coming from, they latch on to one or the other. One of them basically said that the evidence against Darren Wilson was faulty, that people made up stories about hands up, don't shoot, and so on and so forth, and the grand jury was right not to indict him for the killing of Michael Brown. The other study, and that's popular among people who are generally supportive of law enforcement, the other study showed the Ferguson Police Department was using the local population as a piggy bank instead of local taxes. The fines and fees were really being used to finance local expenditures, and a huge number of people were just being harassed for no reason at all other than the fact that it's harder to raise politically local taxes to finance government expenditures than to get it from fines and fees from minor violations that are escalating. Now, depending on where you're coming from politically, you latch on to one or other of these things. But think about the second report. I mean, and it's not, policing is very decentralized in the United States. So this is not about every jurisdiction. But think about the effects of that on trust between police and communities, about witness cooperation, about the likelihood that you're going to come forward. Obviously, it's going to have an effect that will prevent people, that will cause people to avoid any kind of interaction with law enforcement, even if it has some long-run benefits for the community as a whole if everyone were to do it. So this just gets to the point that I think it's really important on these set of issues especially to just open oneself up to a very broad range of opinion.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, wherever the mic is going.
Thank you. Well, first commentary. In Jacksonville, Florida, my childhood, it was very intriguing to see the police, how they took down a local gang, not as big as, the Crips and all this, but very, a local gang that's made up of young Black boys killing each other in the street. It's very sad. But one of the gang leaders got shot and killed in Tampa, Florida. The police quickly arrested and dismantled the entire gang in Jacksonville, Florida. So 2 opposing gangs. They shot and killed one leader in Tampa, Florida. The police quickly, which goes to the surveillance. They knew these people. They knew where they were. Many of them had records, and they just, I guess, chose not to act. But as soon as this bloodbath was about to blow up, they took it down. And so, but to the other part, I heard someone mention confidence, and I feel like, and with the commentary and exhortation, I feel like that's a missing piece in these communities. A lot of these boys don't have confidence in themselves to strip away from the culture that is their culture, that is their social capita. That's something that we've been hearing about. And so to all these soft skills that we've been hearing from previous sessions, how do you propose giving those soft skills, that soft skill of confidence to these young men? Because I feel like that's something that they do miss out on. They're gaining all this confidence in their social network, which is not socially acceptable, but giving it to them in a different way.
Yeah, so this is something that I've been thinking about, and I think we kind of got some hints of it in the previous presentation with respect to the importance of place. And I'll just answer the question with a little bit about my own life, and I'll do so quickly because I know we're up against time. So I, do not come from a well-off family. My dad's a high school dropout who became a cop, and my mom stayed at home and took care of us mostly. So didn't have a lot of money, didn't have people in my family, in my social circle who were lawyers, doctors, white-collar professionals. And yet, I find myself in places like this today on a pretty regular basis. And when I think about my early life, I would have been extremely intimidated to be in these settings. And what changed that were the experiences that pushed me out of my immediate community, out of my neighborhood, out of my close social and family circle. Things like working at my grandfather's tailor shop in Soho, where I got to interact with his clients, most of whom were Wall Street guys who were coming in and throwing $2,000 Brioni suits on the counter to get them dry cleaned. And you have enough of those interactions and you start to realize, oh yeah, the guy with the Harvard crew t-shirt, sure he went to Harvard, but he's actually not that smart. I can have a conversation. And so it made me significantly less intimidated, right? It sort of repeated exposures to that sort of thing demystified white success, for lack of a better term. And the other experience was moving from Flatbush, Brooklyn to Long Island. Going from a mostly Black and Puerto Rican community to where no one's parents were kind of sort of living the high life, I guess, to a community where most of my classmates had parents who were white-collar professionals, who were doctors, who were lawyers, who were business people, financiers. And that was the first time that I got to sort of compare myself academically against kids who I knew would likely follow the path of their parents. And that was also a source of confidence for me. So I do think that there's something to getting people out of the places in which these pathologies are repeating themselves over and over again and expose them to other options, other ways of life, other paths that they can take. How you do that through public policy, I think, is extremely complicated and maybe even impossible. But it is worth thinking about. And again, I kind of return to Thomas Sowell and the work that he did, kind of explaining economic inequality in part through just the chance of the geography around where your people are from and how long lasting those effects can be. I think that particularly in minority communities in the US, there's this kind of sort of invisible mountain range that culture has built around certain neighborhoods. I mean, I can't tell you how many kids from the South Bronx or East Harlem I speak to whose entire world is like an 8-block radius. They don't leave. They're a subway ride away, one stop away from 86th Street where they can have access for free to amazing museums, and they don't go. And so getting us past that, I think, is how I would answer your question. I'm sorry to take more time. If there's anything you guys quickly want to add, otherwise we'll close to keep us
No, I'm good.
5 minutes late. All right, thank you all so much. We're going to take a very short break, but please do make your way back for another conversation with Eric, Nat, and Mac.